Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our listeners. This is Barry Muller, your host for the RevAmp podcast. I have Natalie Peled David here with us as our guest today. Really excited to have her. Seen her on some of the Slack channels in the RevOps community, and she's pretty active on LinkedIn, and she has a lot to say today. I'm really excited to have her. Natalie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks so much, Barry. Really excited to be here as well. Among the greats that you've hosted on this podcast. So, as you said, my name is Natalie, and I have been in sales and sales management and sales leadership for the past 12 years or so for Israeli and US based B2B tech companies. Most recently as a GTM leader for a Series A startup in the MarTech space, and now kind of in between roles and advising for different kind of early stage companies on their go-to-market approaches.
Awesome, cool. So there's a lot we could talk about. We spoke for a few minutes before this call about what we could talk about, and we listed about like 10 different things. So we're going to try to focus for our listeners. And I think one thing that caught my attention was that you were also leading sales and customer success, I believe, at your last position. Maybe you can tell us about how that started, because I don't think you started helping with customer success when you first began there. Is that correct?
That's right. So it was definitely an evolution. I was hired to PX to basically build out the initial sales team, sales strategy, and prepare the company for scale. And did that successfully for the first 3.5 years that I was at the company, with some ups and downs and no shortage of mistakes along the way. But we were able to hit our goals, bring in great new clients for the company, demonstrate a lot of added value to those clients' businesses, and kind of grow on the front end. What we noticed was that we also had a lot of great longstanding clients and a lot of success in terms of managing those relationships over time, but we needed to unify our go-to-market strategy. We needed to have kind of one synced approach to how we were going to land clients and expand those relationships over time. And so after about 3.5 years, I was tapped to take on the challenge, take on the opportunity to manage client success as well as sales, and unify that under one whole kind of go-to-market revenue approach.
Okay, cool. So let's go into those details. So expand, would that include, is that more upselling? Is that selling new products that they didn't sign up for originally? What did that include?
So we had a combination of a kind of fixed fee and a usage-based component to the way that clients could use our services and solutions. And what we wanted to see was how we could drive clients to greater levels of usage, but also more strategic commitments to how they were going to embed the platform into their ongoing business operations. And so it was really about selling more strategic, more sticky elements of our products and services to the existing clients and getting them to adopt our solutions more broadly.
Well, so really increasing the revenue across multiple kind of products, if you will. And okay, cool. And so let's even talk more about that. Which part maybe surprised you when you first started in the client success, in the success position? Because you were doing sales for, I think you said 3.5 years. So which part were you like, wait, that was what you expected at this point, or something else that surprised you when you were talking to the customers that maybe even you sold to?
I can tell you that I had always had a lot of admiration for client success teams in general. Like at every point, having been in sales and having had to rely on a very strong client success or account management team to help grow and cultivate those relationships and deliver value realization and deliver kind of impact to the clients, I'd always had a ton of admiration and respect for how challenging that role was. And I think that in the transition to managing client success, that just deepened. A conversation that I had with my CEO pretty soon after that transition, I said to him, wow, that is the hardest job in the organization. And it's not that sales wasn't hard. It was just with client success, they were essentially at the intersection of every single thing that was going on in the organization, for better or for worse. And so they had the incredible responsibility of handling, fielding, troubleshooting, managing any situation that came their way, whether it was a client who, was excited about the way that they were experiencing our product and wanted new features and functionalities built on, or whether it was a client that had a concern. CS needed to be kind of at the front lines of all of that and maintain their cool and maintain their professionalism. And I just had and continue to have a really deep respect for how multifaceted they needed to be.
Okay, cool. So that gives us the surprise from the role of the customer success. Now, any surprises on maybe like, again, you sold probably to some of these people. Were there any things that you're like, wait, why do you think that your customer that I spoke to, why do you think that a year after using or months after buying the product, were there any like customer expectations that you had to deal with?
I think what we learned was that we had initially had kind of a broader approach to which kinds of clients we thought we could serve well long term. And over time, we came to really segment our successes more specifically and understand which client profiles we were best equipped to successfully serve now versus later, and having to make some of those tough calls around what that meant. So if we weren't able to do a good job with a certain segment of clients now, what's the lift? What's the work that we're going to need to put into it as an organization, whether it's headcount, whether it's new elements of platform features and services, whether it was a support layer that needed to look different, and were we prepared as an organization to make those investments? And if not now, then when? So there were some, useful insights there around where can we really be most effective and where can we be the best fit for our clients today versus what are some of the clients that we might need to say no to in the short term, and how do we bring those insights all the way to the top of the sales funnel so that we don't have that kind of breakdown in communication once they're already kind of signed a contract or something like that.
Right, perfect. Okay, cool. So that's interesting. So now let me ask you a question. If you weren't in the customer success and with sales, do you think it would have been harder to communicate that holistic approach to be able to bring that back to the sales team? Or you think it would have been around the same? Were there any different biases you had because you were on the sales and the customer success? Good biases or bad biases?
I think that's a great question. I think, you're always shaped by your perspective, and your understanding of a situation is often going to be shaped by your perspective. I can say one of the things that I've cultivated over the years, tried to cultivate for myself and certainly for my team, is trying to understand the broader context in which certain decisions are made, or the broader context in which organizational choices are considered. And I do think that while, as head of sales, I did have a very kind of company holistic approach and what's going to be best for the company and its growth. I think the perspective that shifted once I was a little bit deeper into the trenches with the client success team was an understanding of when certain clients are not successful, it's not because X, Y, or Z didn't do their job well or X, Y, or Z dropped the ball, right? There's a lot of opinions that you can have when you're kind of on the other side of a certain situation. And I think that unification of the teams and the aligning of the perspectives of the teams definitely helped me see that differently, where I realized it wasn't a person problem. It was more of a kind of organizational problem that we needed to solve through making some tough choices. And yes, I think by the time I had made that transition, I had earned enough trust from the sales team that when we had to have these conversations around, okay, certain client profiles may or may not be a great fit for us, and therefore here's how we're going to adjust our pipelines, and therefore here's how we're going to adjust our conversations, and even our pricing models, there was more credibility to go along with that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's say you don't have that luxury of credibility or that trust. How could someone in customer success make it easy for sales to understand, or do they really just have to go straight to management who has more of that holistic view to be able to create that change management?
I think creating visibility and transparency can go a really long way. So I think one of the things that I noticed, our client success team at the time, they were so busy and they knew a lot of the answers. They knew a lot of what needed to change, but they were so busy just managing kind of all the things that were happening on their plate that that taking a moment to stop and consider how somebody else who wasn't in the trenches with them might perceive a decision to, let's say, stop serving a specific client segment. They didn't necessarily think about how can we present that information transparently? How can we make this a bit of a business case? How can we show the raw data that's leading us to the conclusion that will ultimately be able to serve more clients more effectively if we isolate this specific subset? And so ultimately it came down to just documenting a little bit better, even in like a rough Excel sheet, but documenting, here are the clients, here's what's working well, here's what's not working well, here's what we've tried, here's our proposal, and then being able to share that with the sales team where each of the people involved have like a vested interest in this client, that deal that I brought on, but then being able to see how it played out and being able to see how much time and attention and dedication each of those clients really had been given. It can allay some of the concerns around, again, is this a drop the ball situation, or is this an organizational decision that we need to make so that we all succeed?
Right, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. I know I have that at my position. I'm not in customer success, but going and doing work that's sometimes you're so busy, you just do work, and you don't have time to take that one step back. Recently, I started taking that one step back, even without that time, and it just has propelled my work further. Because taking that step back made me feel lazy, but actually now I'm accomplishing more for the company by proposing business cases and use cases and challenges I had and how to overcome that because I took that step back. So absolutely, I think that could be good for, yeah.
I was just going to say, I recently heard somebody kind of articulate this pretty well. It's a lady named Ali Rizakos, and she's actually an imposter syndrome coach and leads some great workshops. But she recently talked about kind of one of the ways in which this plays out is that you assume that the things that everybody else must know. Like that's one of the ways that you sometimes can diminish yourself or develop that sense that, okay, maybe I don't have the most brilliant insights and maybe it's not worth sharing. It's out of this assumption that, well, if I figure this out, probably all the other smart people in the company or probably all the other smart people in my department have already figured this out. So it may not be worth saying, or it may not be worth presenting. But I think that's, again, where people in the organization need to recognize that everyone's coming from their own perspective. And sometimes it really can help to build consensus or new awareness when you take the time to walk other people through not only your conclusions, but the data and the observations that led you to those conclusions, and then bring people on board.
Love that. I also love that there's imposter syndrome coaches. I would love a different time to talk more about that. I think let's move this conversation to more processes, which I think it's not really moving. It's building on our conversation. But I would love to hear something we were talking before, that you are a process-oriented salesperson. It's not something you see in every salesperson. I would love to hear how you became a process-oriented salesperson and what that even means for our listeners.
Yeah, so I think we're seeing the rise of more and more process-oriented salespeople, as well as the rise of kind of hand in hand with the rise of the RevOps function as a whole, and recognizing that when organizations need to grow, they can look for that growth. Yeah, they can throw headcount at it and they can say, okay, let's hire 50 more salespeople. Or they can say, well, what else can we do to extract greater effectiveness, greater productivity, and greater outcomes from the existing resources by rethinking process improvements, workflows, handoffs, and any other areas of friction that are preventing the business from running smoothly. And so that's always been a place where I've been a nerd. I mean, just that simple. And it started out from just being a member of sales teams. So it wasn't with any like real formal authority. As a member of sales teams, I can remember super early on when I was working at a company called Matomi. I was on a great sales team. We had a lot of fun, a lot of laughs, a lot of kind of competitions that we would just create for ourselves and silly jokes and things like that. But we also had some areas of friction in being able to get our work done. And those were things that interested me. Like, hey, if I'm experiencing this area of friction and it's causing me a little bit of frustration, how can I solve this? Not just for myself, but for our team. And so I would look for ways that I could hack little improvements to our CRM so that we wouldn't have to enter data like 500 times or that we would have more dependencies of data. So if I said A, then the drop-down menu would have B, C, and D choices, and I wouldn't have to kind of re-enter things. But one notable process was around the financial part of getting a deal done. So we worked on a pro forma basis where clients would prepay us. We were in the ad tech space and clients were essentially prepaying for some of the advertising and marketing solutions that we were going to provide. And we were based out of Tel Aviv. So we were operating globally. And we needed to secure these prepayments from, clients all over the world, which could really derail the deal momentum. Like you've built up this momentum, you've got the sales cycle in a certain place, you finally got the contract signed, and then you're just sitting there waiting for a prepayment to come through. And it can be a matter of 2 days, but it could also be a matter of 2 weeks. And in that time, it could kind of bring things to a screeching halt, and that felt unnecessary. So around that time, I reached out to a buddy of mine, or somebody who became a buddy of mine in the finance department, and really tried to understand, okay, what were the critical components that he needed in order to run a really smooth accounts receivable process? And then how could we kind of multi-track that? So rather than having things run sequentially in our sales process, which of those things could we pull forward and start to run on parallel paths so that we could get to the finish line pretty much at the same time without slowing down the deal? And that was just one really great accomplishment where we were able to shorten our sales cycles, reduce some of that friction, but also build some cross-functional bridges, which ultimately helped us over time.
Absolutely. So let's even go talk about that a little bit more. How come that time was, like, how important was momentum to the deal? Like, did you see a difference before and after once that solution was solved?
Yeah, we were getting kind of deals moving and into integration, and we were getting if prior to that change, we typically saw like a 2 to 3 week delay between contract signing to launching of a new client's program, we were able to shorten that to under a week, and in some cases even less than half a week. And so the benefit there was that we got the clients excited, rightly so, because the solutions that we were going to deliver were going to be fantastic for them. But we retained that excitement through kind of the contract signing process and some of the administrative work, and moved them with that enthusiasm and excitement into the handoff, into the conversations with our account management team, and really kept that momentum going. They were much more engaged in that process versus having kind of gone through the boring and kind of administrative stuff, which can really derail any deal, right? Like nobody loves to be in the minutia of, wait, did you get the contract? Wait, did you send the invoice? Wait, did your finance team get it? Wait, can you check, can you follow those things up? Today, there's so many solutions that can, one-stop shop that whole process with like the click of a button. And I think Deal Hub is probably, among some of those great solutions. But at the time, we were really just, figuring it out as we went. We had a large organization that was operating across multiple channels, multiple countries around the globe. And this was just an overlooked area of delay that once we solved it, really accelerated our path to impact with our clients and kept a lot of, team enthusiasm as well.
Cool, love that. So back to the processing. How did you justify to yourself as a salesperson to not do something that wasn't going to bring in revenue the next minute. Like, how was that something that you had to deal with? We were talking before about imposter syndrome. Was that like a sales syndrome that you had to deal with? Doing something productive for the company, but maybe not as productive for your paycheck the next day?
That is such a great question. And again, I think this changes. I think the narrative around this is changing, and I think that's a welcome change. My personal experience was just having to do both at an excellent level. It was like the table stakes needed to be hitting quota. I could never justify, I was never going to put myself or my company in the situation of having to have a conversation around the fact that, well, I didn't hit quota, but I improved a process. Like I just wasn't going to have that conversation. So my approach was being stellar and making sure I was delivering on my revenue commitments to the organization, whether those were personal commitments or later when I was managing a team and managing a department. So we were on our numbers, but these were things that I would just do like above and beyond because A, I was curious about them, B, I had a knack for them, and C, I did know that those would pay dividends over time. When you have salespeople who are experiencing a point of friction in every single sales process again and again and again and again, and that's embedded into how they're going to sell, that's going to erode motivation over time. And it's a little, it's a little erosion. It's just like a little thing. But if you as a sales leader can identify those little points of friction and remove them, your team is going to be able to operate much more smoothly. And that frees them up to start to also think about how can they solve some organizational challenges or how can they add value beyond just, the minutia of getting this specific deal that they're working on. So that's the added benefit is that this really does, it has a network effect. You solve this little thing, its effect compounds because now every single time we go through a deal cycle, you will have solved that. And that's time and energy that you give back to the sales team to do better and more productive things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sure every manager or CEO wants a person that does that to hit numbers and go above and beyond. Sounds like a dream. So that's great. So what were some other process or points of inertia that you saw when on sales? Now we talked about like the finance, global finance. What were some 2 or 3 other points that you saw in your career?
I think a really notable one, so kind of 2 other points that are pretty common for having friction can be around new hire ramp up and also around sales to client success handoffs. Like those are things that they're easier to detect because I tend to see them in a lot of organizations as these areas of, okay, if we can get this done better, there's a real material benefit for the organization that we can have in the short term. So when we think about new hire onboarding and ramp up, essentially until those new hires are standing on their own 2 feet and independently running their own sales or running their own, work responsibilities, they're a sunk cost for the organization. They're an investment that the organization is making in some future value that the organization is hoping to realize. So the shorter you can make that payback time, the sooner you can ramp people up into their roles with confidence, which is not just about, subject matter expertise, but it's also about navigating the organization. So there's going to be questions or areas that they may not know in the future, but how can you teach them in their first weeks and months on the job how to find answers, how to work well with other stakeholders in the organization so that they can continue to build on their knowledge and expertise. Those can kind of solving for that can be really impactful for the organization. So that's kind of one big area that I've focused on. Every organization that I've worked at, I've left this like onboarding and training guide that's typically been adopted either department or company wide by the time that I've left, because we see that people are embraced really well into the organization, ramp up into their roles with confidence and become, really embedded members of the community, which I think is the goal. And then the other area of focus has really been on that client success handoff. So when you spend X many months working on a deal, learning about the client's business case, understanding what the client needs, what kind of value they're hoping to realize from the product, and ultimately building that relationship with them. What you want to be able to do is transition that very effectively to client success. And if there's any breakdown in that, that can be super damaging. So finding ways to make that smoother, faster, more effective, and have a really great knowledge transfer are things that I've put in place as well.
Yeah, I think both are very critical. With regards to ramp up time, something I've been wondering recently, I've been seeing like KPIs, oh, like this will help you ramp up sales reps in 6 months, or that's like the benchmark, and this will help you decrease ramp up time by 50%. There's some interesting numbers. How do you even, what is the ramp up time? How do you know when your sales rep is ramped after they're hired?
Wow, that's a great question. It's going to look different at every organization, and it's going to depend a lot on what those cycles look like. So if you think about a company that's running much more transactional, kind of shorter sales cycles, I think that ramp up can tend to be faster because you can practice all the parts of your sales cycle much more quickly, much more frequently. But if you extend that sales cycle and you're working in scenarios, which has been kind of the majority of my experience has been with sales cycles that have been anywhere, let's say on average from 3 to 4 months, with of course outliers much shorter and much longer than that. But let's say 3-4 month sales cycles, you need to have your salesperson who's ramping up practice with expertise every single part of that sales cycle enough times that they can make mistakes and enough times that they can actually do it well. So I think managers tend to underestimate how long it takes for people to actually ramp up. But I think if you can think about that, what you want to do is present them with the opportunity to make mistakes, have them make some mistakes early on in low stakes situation, and then ensure that you're shadowing them while they effectively manage, later stage parts of a deal, negotiations of a contract, the process of handing off into the organization, and do those with some guidance and shadowing. If you can do those again on parallel tracks rather than waiting for it all to happen sequentially on their own self-generated pipeline, then you can really accelerate ramp up. So what can that look like? It can mean that you can actually have them take over some mid-stage deals even before they've, quote, earned it, but just so that they can practice managing the second half of a sales cycle much earlier on than it would naturally occur. Or you can have them shadow you in some other high stakes situations so that they see what it's like. And you do a lot of debriefing after every client call so that you can talk through, what did you think? What did you notice? Did anything surprise you? Did you have any questions? Is there anything that you would do differently? And make sure that they're getting that opportunity to envision what success looks like on later stage parts of the cycle. I think those are just some tips. But again, how do you know that somebody's ready? You'll see it. You'll see it when they're ready. Some good tools that I've used along the way have been these 30, 60, 90-day ramp up plans, where at the front end of somebody's, joining the organization, you already identify what are the things that you and the organization are committing to providing them within the first 30, 60, 90 days? And what are the commitments or deliverables or milestones that they need to hit in return? And that's a little bit of this, contract that we make with one another. They're accountable for hitting those milestones. They're accountable for being able to deliver on certain competencies, certain behaviors, certain soft metrics, as well as hard metrics at each of those timeframes. And if people are following that plan, then they're on their way to ramping up successfully.
Cool. I love that. And it's super interesting. And I think for season 3, we'll do that podcast on ramping up sales, because we could go even deeper. I love you have a lot of these tips that I think could be really good for our listeners. Give us some tips on the client, on from the sale to the client success, customer success, that part. One thing I was particularly interested in is how much time the sales rep has to educate the customer success, whether that be time writing notes in Salesforce, or time just being on a phone call, or time making an introduction with everyone on the call. Would love to hear some tips on that.
So again, I would say there's no one size fits all. I think as an organization, you have to figure out what what do you need? What do your clients ultimately need in order to feel supported and to feel that you haven't wasted their time, and that you're not asking them to repeat pieces of information that they've already shared with you, or that you don't act as though you've misplaced key parts of the information that mattered to them. So for the client, we want them to feel supported. We want it to feel seamless. We don't want it to feel labor intensive, right? So we want it to be super, super easy. So that means that a lot of the work and the coordination needs to happen behind the scenes. And again, thinking about that anecdote that I shared with you in the past about that finance piece, what we want to do is see, if it takes a while to figure out who's going to be the account manager. Let's say you're not working in pods, so there might be a little bit of a question mark, like, okay, should Anne or Joe or Barry take this next account? If that's a decision that needs to get made, how can we front load that decision so that we're not waiting until everything is ready to start asking the questions, so we can start to run things in parallel as well. And then consider what's the information that client success needs in order to be able to step into this account and really get the client to realize impact as quickly as possible. So they need to understand who's who. They need to understand the power dynamics. They need to understand what was the client looking for out of this expectation, like what are the expectations of the client? What are they looking for out of this engagement? We need to understand what's the status quo. We need to understand all the relevant metrics that we've heard from the client. So in the case of different marketing technology solutions that I've sold in the past, it's, what's the volume that the client has going on today? What are the conversion rates they've got going on today? What would ROI mean for them? How are they assessing ROI? How quickly can they assess it? What platforms, what tools are they using, right? So getting all that stuff that we've diagnosed early on, making sure that all that information is available to our client success team. And you asked around, how much time and where are they documenting and all of that. I like the idea of trying to kind of put those pieces on the path of work. So rather than having it be this disjointed event where sales all of a sudden sits down to like write a whole handoff, which sometimes can happen and it can be okay, to embed it inside the CRM so that while they're on the path of making this deal happen, as they learn the stats, as they learn the critical information, there's a dedicated place where they can already jot down those notes. And by the end of the deal cycle, they'll have populated probably 85, 90% already of all the information that they're going to need on that handoff document. And then they've just got to put finishing touches on it. What we built at PX, which was great, was a bit of automation into that as well. So information that they put in one part of the CRM would automatically pull into the handoff template. And then once they actually filled out the rest of the handoff template with all the other questions that needed to be answered, with a click of the button, they could submit it, and that would get sent out to the head of client success, the client success team, and we could already start that dialogue around what questions do people have, who's the best suited to manage the account, and how can we kind of get things on the calendar already.
Oh, wow. So thanks. That's really interesting and definitely impactful. So I started off this podcast saying that we talked about 10 things. I think now we talked about 20 things. We could do 10, we could do a whole season just of Natalie. So this was great. Thanks a lot for joining us on this podcast. If people have any questions, where can they reach you specifically?
First off, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun and really, really great chatting with you about all this stuff that I love nerding out about. Best way for people to reach out is on LinkedIn. You can find me there, Natalie Peled David, and I'm happy to chat, talk all things go-to-market, revenue operations, sales leadership, or the transition from sales to all revenue leadership, and really, really happy to talk about these topics in more depth.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks again, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.